So I mentioned 2 weeks ago that you can organize Paul's letter to the Romans in really 3 parts, 3 sections. It can be divided into 3 sections. The diagnosis section, which is the section that we are currently in the middle of, the deliverance section, which I can't wait to get to, and the description section, that part of Romans where Paul describes what a delivered life looks like on the ground. He gets very practical beginning in chapter 12, and he shows what a free life looks like. He describes what a delivered life looks like. So 3 sections. Diagnosis in the first 3 chapters, Paul is diagnosing the human race as all having the same problem. And then beginning in chapter 4 through chapter 11, that's the deliverance section where he is just championing the radicality of the good news that Jesus has done for us, what we could never ever do for ourselves. And then from chapter 12 onward is the description section where he describes what this free life looks like. And the whole point of Romans chapter 1 through 3 is to diagnose everyone, every single human being with the same disease. So what Paul's doing here, and this is not the easiest section of Romans to read because there's really no good news at all in this section. What he's doing here is he's eliminating all exits. He's closing all of the back doors. He's eliminating all loopholes because he wants to make one point. No one is righteous. Everyone, in fact, is unrighteous. Everyone is guilty. Everyone is deserving of condemnation. Everyone is deserving of God's wrath. Everyone is guilty. Moral people are guilty and immoral people are guilty. Religious people are guilty and irreligious people are guilty. Regardless, and we saw this last week, regardless of your political convictions, background, sexual orientation, he levels the playing field in this section, these 3 chapters. He levels the playing field by showing that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We make distinctions between sins and sinful acts horizontally, but when it comes to sin before God, God makes one pronouncement. All are guilty, all have sinned and fallen short of my glory. So it's important, I think, to note here real quick that nothing Paul says here, even though it may sound like that at first when you read it, nothing Paul says here is anti-Jewish. I mean, he himself is a Jew, and he says in Romans chapter 9, we'll get there in a few weeks, he says in Romans chapter 9, I wish that I myself could be cast off for my people. There's nothing in this section that is anti-Jewish. What he's doing here is he's simply addressing a problem then, a problem that existed then, that also exists now, because what we have in common with the Jews that Paul was addressing is that they have the oracles of God, just like we have the scriptures today in front of us. He says in chapter 3, verse 2, then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. God didn't give his law to the Philistines. He didn't give his law to the Canaanites, the Amalekites, all the other ites. He gave his law specifically to Israel. That's who he gave his law to. He selected them, specially chose them, and gave his law to them. And so in the same way, he has given us his word. We're not left to our own devices trying to figure out who God is or what God has said, either in the past or in the present or about the future. We have it. This is God's word. It's not a man-made book. It's a God-made book. Everything in it is true, and therefore we can go to it and find out who God is, what God requires, what God has done because we have failed to meet his requirements. And so in the same way that it was beneficial for the Jews to have the oracles of God, the law of God, it's beneficial for us to have the Bible, to have the scriptures. But this is the problem. And this is what we have in common with the Jews that Paul was addressing. They have the oracles of God. We have the scriptures. They were treating God's law the way many of us inside the church treat God's law. And this is the problem he's addressing. What God has given for the purpose of diagnosis, we have co-opted into a tool for our own self-deliverance. And I've said that on numerous occasions. We take what God says in the Bible and we treat the Bible as if it is a moralistic self-help manual sent from heaven. In other words, we take this Bible and we read it, and if we properly and perfectly apply its timeless principles, then we too can have our best life now. So this is really nothing more than a self-improvement manual. Well, that's exactly the way the Jewish people that Paul was addressing here were treating God's law. They were taking a tool that God intended to diagnose them and show them just how desperate they were, and they were co-opting that tool and using it as a way to deliver themselves. If they can just keep the law and do everything the law says and cross their T's and dot their I's, then they too will be justified. And Paul mentions that in chapter 2, verse 13, for it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. In other words, what he goes on to say is, if the law is your basis for deliverance, you better keep it perfectly. Perfectly. I mean, you have got to not only keep it perfectly on the outside, and this is what he's getting into when he gets down to verse 25 down through verse 29 of chapter 2. It's not enough that you simply keep the law on the outside and do everything that God demands on the outside. You have to want to do everything God demands all the time. It's not just your actions that need to be pure 100% of the time. It's your motives that need to be pure 100% of the time. In other words, if you want to be justified by law keeping, you better do it perfectly. You better come into this world perfect. You better never mess up, never sin, never do anything that you're guilty of or ashamed of. And you have to want to do the right thing all the time. And you have to not want to do the wrong thing all of the time perfectly. And that's what Paul's getting at here. So I was interviewed a while back, this past fall, and one of the questions that the interviewer asked me was this: in what ways is grace most commonly misunderstood today? This was the question that I was asked. And this was my answer. It was a written question and it was a written answer. This was my answer. I think the main way that grace is misunderstood today is when people confuse it with cheapened law. Think of the first and greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Or think of Jesus' crushing line in the Sermon on the Mount. You therefore must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Grace, for many people, is the reduction of God's expectations of us. Because of grace, we think, we just need to try hard. Grace becomes this law-cheapening agent attempting to make the law easier to follow. So, love the Lord with all of your heart becomes try to love God more than your work. Be perfect gets cheapened into just do your best. That's really the problem. Now, doing this, when we do this, and we do, this is what they were guilty of. This is what we are guilty of. Doing this enables us to do what we desperately want to do, to think that we're better than we actually are. There is not a person on the planet that doesn't desperately want to think that they're better than they are, which is why we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. Constantly comparing ourselves to other people. Constantly taking an inventory of other people so that we can measure ourselves, and we feel really, really, really good about ourselves when we take an inventory of someone whose spirituality or giftedness or looks or whatever aren't nearly as good as ours. And we feel really, really bad about ourselves if we take an inventory of someone's spirituality or gifts or looks or financial situation or whatever, and we're much worse than they are. They're better than us. This is what happens. Each and every one of us desperately. In other words, we actually think we can find life and freedom and salvation. We actually think we can find these things if we come to the conclusion or if we convince ourselves that we're better than we are. And one of the ways that we do that as people inside the church is to cheapen God's demands. Be perfect is just try your best. Grace becomes nothing more and nothing less than just try your best. You know, God will sweep the rest under the rug. He's a really nice guy. He'll do, you do your best and God will do the rest. That sort of thing. That is one of the chief ways that grace is misunderstood today, because the fact is, Christians are hypocrites. We're hypocrites. Do you ever get mad when you hear people outside the church call Christians hypocrites? Why? You are. So am I. We're hypocrites. This is Paul's point in verse 17 through 24. This is precisely what he's saying. We say we believe and love God, and yet our thoughts and our words and our deeds demonstrate that we live for ourselves. We talk a lot about love. We know that Jesus was big on love. We study the texts that tell us to love, but we don't really love much. Or at least our love is conditional. Now, don't get me wrong. We love the people who are like us, who agree with us, who support and affirm us. But as Jesus told us, even non-Christians do that. Loving someone who loves you, that's easy. The countercultural nature of Christianity is a pack of people who love those who hate them. We're the loudest when it comes to championing the standards of God's law, and yet we break that law every day. Unless we're doing it perfectly, inside and out, we're breaking it. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We talk about how God hates unrighteousness a lot, but we're much slower to talk about how much he hates self-righteousness. It's a big difference. We're quick to identify the idols of our culture, the idols out there, but much slower to identify the idols inside the church. In here, we can spot someone else's sin a mile away. But then we justify ourselves when someone points out our sin. How defensive, how instinctively defensive do we get when someone points out a fault or a failure of ours? How easy is it for us to identify the fault or the failure or the mishap of someone else? We can see it a mile away. A mile away. But the moment someone corrects us or shows us an area or a place or a mistake that we have made or whatever, we get defensive quickly. We're quick to defend ourselves. We're quick to fight for our rights. We're quick to flex our muscles. We generally like to think that we're better than other people. We're proud that we're not like them, But Paul's point here is that we're just like them. We're exactly like them. There is no difference in diagnosis from people out there and people in here. In fact, and this is interesting, in a certain sense, says Martin Luther, we're worse. And this is why Luther says that. We're worse because we know better. When I baptize babies, which, thank God, I do a lot these days. I mentioned last week that the fastest growing demographic in our church is the nursery. Unbelievable. It's wonderful. It's a great future for our church. But you know, when I baptize children and I get up before I baptize a baby and I explain what's actually taking place at baptism. I mean, you know, there's a lot of confusion both inside and outside the church with regard to what baptism actually is. When we're baptizing babies, specifically children of Christian parents. And one of the things that I say is God has specially blessed this child because God has sovereignly and graciously placed this child into the care of a Christian church and under the care of Christian parents. And therefore, this child's going to grow up hearing things that millions of other children won't hear. Hearing things about God, hearing things about Jesus, hearing things about the cross and what Jesus did for sinners like you and me. They're going to grow up praying before meals and all of those sorts of things. That's a big deal. That is a very special privilege. And so Paul's point is, because we have the oracles of God, because God's word has been delivered to us in a sense, we're worse hypocrites. I mean, we're even worse because we know better. I mean, those of us who grew up in Christian homes or read our Bibles or go to church, we should know better. You know, I'm always shocked at Christians who are shocked when non-Christians act like non-Christians. It's unbelievable. It's like, what do you expect? I mean, Paul says they are not without excuse because the law is written on their hearts, the fleshly tablets of their hearts, and therefore their conscience bears witness to the fact that they're doing something wrong. I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to feel guilty about doing something bad. When non-Christian people feel guilty or ashamed because they've done something bad, that's the law of God written on the fleshly tablets of their hearts accusing them. They know better in that regard. But we really know better because not only do we have the law written on our hearts, we have it here. We've got it. It's in our hands. It's in front of you. I mean, we have it. And so we should know better. And Paul says, so we are perhaps even greater hypocrites than those outside the church. Here's the good news, okay? People who know that they're bad are much, much closer to the grace of God than people who think that they're good. That is a very, very, very important point, that those who know that they're bad, and this is what Paul's going to get into as we get into later chapters, those who know that they're bad are actually much, much closer to the grace of God than those who think that they're good. And you see that throughout the Gospels. I mean, look at the people who flock to Jesus. Look at the people who respond to his message of forgiveness and mercy and grace. Look at the kinds of people. It's people who know that they're bad. Prostitutes and tax collectors. And look at those who were constantly accusing Jesus, trying to trick Jesus. It was those people who thought that they were good. So it always surprises me when you read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that it is the prodigal younger brother who gets grace, for instance, before the religious, moral older brother. It's the prostitute who gets the gospel faster than the Pharisee. It's the people who know that they're bad, who are much closer to the grace of God and experience God's grace much more than people who think that they're good. Francis Spufford, this is an amazing quote. My friend David Zoll, who will be here at Liberate, by the way, which you're coming to if you want to go to heaven, okay? My friend David Zoll, who lives up in Charlottesville, Virginia, sent me this quote last night from an English writer by the name of Francis Spufford. This is just mind-blowing. I read it to Kim this morning. I don't think she was paying attention, but it's unbelievable. This quote, I went to bed with a smile on my face because of this. She just says this so well. Christianity isn't supposed to be about gathering up the good people and excluding the bad people, which, by the way, is the way most people out there think that we think Christianity is. Okay, that's what they think. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that Steve Brown, who will also be at Liberate, which you will register for if you want to go to heaven, all right? Steve Brown said to me one time that his dad, who he loved dearly, but a guy who was rough around the edges, was kind of shocked when Steve became a preacher, when Steve became a minister. And Steve spent a lot of his time trying to, share the gospel with his father and that sort of thing. And his dad basically said, I'll never, ever go to church. And Steve said, why? And he said, because I'm not good like those people. So he, somewhere along the way, and I know people use that as an excuse, okay? I'm not saying people don't use that as an excuse, but there are lots of people who think that that's what we think about ourselves. So Spufford says, Christianity isn't supposed to be about gathering up the good people and excluding the bad people for the very simple reason that there aren't any good people. Christianity, he says, can slip into being a club or a cozy affinity group or a wall against the world, but it isn't supposed to be. What it's supposed to be, and I love this, is a league of the guilty. That's what it is. You think about what kind of rebranding of the Christian faith would take place if we believe this. If the loudest thing our world heard was our acknowledgement of weakness and guilt, and not, we're going to take you over. We're going to flex our muscles. I mean, think about what kind of a testimony it would be to our culture if Christians were honest about their desperation. And if Christians were the first to say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and I am the chief of sinners, like Paul said. I don't know as much about your sin problem as I do my own, but I'm pretty sure I'm worse than you. You imagine that? What kind of rebranding would take place of the Christian faith? If you pulled up to a gas station and were pumping gas in your car, and there was a stranger on the other side pumping gas in his or her car, and you simply asked them a question and said, when I say the word evangelical, what comes to mind? What do you think they would say? They would say something about something political. Something about our stance on social issues and that sort of thing. That would be the first thing that comes to mind. They wouldn't give a theological answer. I mean, evangelicalism, the word evangel, literally means good news. That's what it means. In other words, evangelicals are supposed to be good news specialists in a world of bad news. In a world of pressure and performance, Christianity is this glorious, top-down announcement that it is finished. It's a theological thing first. Well, so based on the answer that the person at the gas station might give you, should indicate that there is a bit of a branding problem when it comes to Christianity, evangelicalism in particular. There's a bit of a branding problem. There's been a bit of a marketing problem. If the first thing that comes to mind is something political, not that that's irrelevant, not that that's unimportant, but if that's the first thing that comes to mind, if it's not a theological answer, then it reveals that we've got some sort of a branding problem. And so think about if we carried ourselves as league of the guilty. You know? I mean, we looked at last week how when we are judgmental, Paul says, God judges. He has, he is, and he will. When we become judge and jury over someone or some group, it's idolatry because we are putting ourselves in the place of God. I mean, he says that in the verses that we read last week. I mean, you who judge others, do you not judge yourself? It's so easy for me to identify the speck in your eye and ignore the log in my own. I mean, the Bible is replete with this stuff. It's like, I don't know how we miss it. I mean, all over the place. The Bible is replete with this stuff. So the issue, listen, here comes the good news, okay? The issue is not whether or not we're hypocritical. We are. Everybody is. The issue is that Christians are free to admit our hypocrisy because our hope is not in our goodness or our law keeping. It is in the one who is good for us. It is in the one who kept the law for us. We're free then. This is huge, life-changing. We are free to admit our imperfections. We're free to admit our weaknesses because our confidence, our identity rests in Jesus' strength, not ours. His perfection, not ours. His performance, not ours. Steve Brown, who will be at Liberate, I'm not going to do it again. In his most recent book, 3 Free Sins, you know, he's such a shock jock, which is what I love about him. So he names a book 3 Free Sins, just so you'll pick it up and read it. He says it's not even that good of a book, but it's an amazing title. Therefore, people will buy it. He literally says that. He goes, I'm a terrible book writer, but I come up with the best titles. And he says, really, a title is what sells a book, so I'm fine. But he says this in his book, 3 Free Sins, and I have found this for the past 2 years very, very helpful. He says, one time I spoke for the national gathering of my denomination, which is our denomination, and said some rather controversial things. Surprise, surprise. After my session, I was confronted by a serious young man in a 3-piece suit and a concerned look on his face. Dr. Brown, he said, what you said today grieved my heart. Grieved your heart, I responded. There is nothing big enough here to grieve your heart. We're one of the smallest denominations in America, and I'm a peon. Find something bigger to grieve your heart. I could totally hear Steve saying this. You mean you don't want to hear, he said quietly and with a godly patience, what a fellow pastor has to say? I thought about it for a moment and said, no, not really. But if you want to say something and be honest about it, I'll listen, at least for a minute. I think, he said, his voice rising for the first time. Really spiritual people don't shout, but he was close. That you are arrogant, rude, and prideful. Steve writes, you know what I said? I said, bingo. You have read me well, but I'm better than I was. Your heart would have been even more grieved 5 years ago, and it would be even more grieved if you knew the whole truth about me now. He said, we ended up talking for over an hour, and he eventually loosened his tie. All things considered, it was a rather honest and good discussion, but that's not the point. The point is how I felt when I said bingo. Once I said that, I had an incredibly wonderful feeling of freedom and joy. Generally, I would have defended myself. I'm quite good at doing that. I would have engaged him in a debate and eaten his lunch. I have a glib tongue and I know how to use it. I may have worked to belittle him and his judgmental spirit. Any preacher can do that well. I didn't. I just told him that he had read me well. Do you know what I experienced with that one word, bingo? I felt free and powerful. In fact, it felt so good, I've decided to do it more. I call it the bingo retort. You're wrong. Bingo. I've been wrong at least 50% of the time. You're selfish. Bingo. My mother said the same thing and my wife agrees with her. You're not living up to your potential. Bingo. If it's okay with you, I'm not going to live up to my potential a while longer. You're not fit to be a Christian. Bingo. That's why Christ died for me. You're a preacher. You're certainly not spiritually qualified to be a preacher. Bingo. I've often said the same thing to God. How can you be a Christian and say or do that? Bingo. I sometimes wonder that myself. The bingo retort. Can you imagine how that would change? Literally, how would that change just about every relationship you had? If every time you as a husband or wife were criticized by your spouse and you simply said, bingo, you're right. I'm going to take the bullet right out of their gun. And that's the goal, to take the bullet out of your spouse's gut. That's the goal of marriage, all right? Well, that's the answer to how to do that. I mean, you know, if you just, anytime someone criticizes you, bingo, because whatever it is they're criticizing is just the tip of the iceberg. Can you imagine if that person criticizing you was able to get down deep into the dark recesses of your heart and your mind and see what you always think about, what passes through your mind, what passes through your heart, your motivations, all those things? So when you know yourself to be desperate and bad, when someone criticizes you, it's easy to say, bingo. Can you imagine how that would rebrand Christianity? If every time the church was criticized, we said, bingo. I mean, in fact, we're a lot worse than your criticism. Can you imagine taking the bullet right out of their gun? You see, it's only when we see, and this is Paul's point here, it's only when we see that the way of God's law is absolutely inflexible, will we see that the way of God's grace is absolutely indispensable. Because a high view of the law reminds us that God accepts us on the basis of Christ's perfection, not our progress. Grace, properly understood, is the movement of a holy God toward an unholy people. God doesn't cheapen the law or ease its requirements. He fulfills the law in his Son, who then gives his righteousness to us free of charge. And that is the gospel, pure and simple. That is the gospel that Paul champions. That is the gospel that alone can set us free. That is good news. So like the adulterous woman in John 8, we're all caught in the act. Every single one of us are caught in the act, discovered in a shameful breach of God's law. And though, as Jesus looked at this woman and saw the Pharisees who dragged her there and said, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. And of course, as you know, they all dropped their rocks and slowly walked away. And what I love about that passage is it says they slowly walked away, starting with the oldest down to the youngest. What's telling to me about that is people who are older, who have lived longer, who've suffered more, are a little bit more realistic about their condition. It's the young idealists who are still holding on to an idealistic understanding of themselves, Steve Brown says, when this is hilarious, he was my preaching professor in seminary, and he said, he would say things in class about ministry and preaching and that sort of thing, and he said, there was always, these 25, 26-year-old, theological students that would raise their hand and say, well, I disagree with that. And Steve would say, you're not old enough to even have an opinion yet. Young people tend to be more idealistic. I've said this before. When I was 25, I was going to change the world. Change the world. And now that I'm 41, my perspective's a bit different. I've suffered enough, teenage boys, just death in the family. I mean, you just suffer. You come to greater and greater terms with your own brokenness. And so now, instead of I'm going to change the world, it's I can't change my wife. I can't change my kids. I can't change my church. Thank God for Jesus. Okay? It's a much more freeing motto to live by than I'm going to change the world. Well, the older people walked away first. Walked away. Made more sense to them. You know what? I'm getting more frail. I know myself fairly well. And I'm not without sin. It was the younger people who stayed the longest, holding on to their own sense of righteousness, who eventually walked away. But they all throw their stones down, they walk away. And we, like the adulterous woman in John 8, we're all caught in the act. And though no one on earth can throw the first stone, God can. And God did. The wonder of all wonders is that the rock of condemnation that we justly deserved was hurled by the Father onto the Son. A rock was thrown. We can't throw it, but God can. And God did. The lawmaker became the lawkeeper and died for us lawbreakers. And that's what Paul is going to just explain and articulate so beautifully as we get into chapter 4 and 5 and 6. Luther said this may be some of the best advice I've ever been given. So when the devil throws your sins in your face and declares that you deserve death and hell, tell him this: I admit that I deserve death and hell. So what? For I know one who suffered and made satisfaction on my behalf. His name is Jesus Christ, Son of God, and where he is, there I shall be also. Well, may the accuser roar of sins that I have done. I know them all and thousands more. Jehovah knoweth none. Let's pray together.